I cannot say. They might have recognized me, even if they hadn't known my face, by my Gould repeater watch. But some wretched camp followers had been before them. On the watch were engraved the McAllister arms. But the watch had been stolen, so they picked up, either out of purpose or by mistake, O'Hooligan's trunk and my nether portion, and put them together into one case. You see, a man's legs are not so easily identified, so his body and my lower limbs were made ready together to be forwarded to Scotland. But how did not Colonel Graham see personally to the matter? He could not. He was so much engaged over regimental duties. Still, he might have stretched a point, I think. It must have been difficult to send the portions so far. Was the body embalmed? Embalmed? No. There was no one in Bayonne who knew how to do it. There was a bird stuffer in the Rue Ponceau, but he had done nothing larger than a seagull. So there could be no question of embalming. We, that is, the bit of O'Hooligan and the bit of me, were put into a cask of eau-de-vie, and so forwarded by a sailing vessel. And either on the way to Southampton, or on another boat from that port to Edinburgh, the sailors ran a gimlet into the barrel, and inserted a straw, and drank up all the spirits. It was all gone by the time the hogshead reached Auchimachi. Whether O'Hooligan gave a smack to the liquor I cannot say, but I can answer for my legs they would impart a grateful flavour of whisky. I was always a drinker of whisky, and when I had taken a considerable amount, it always went to my legs. They swerved, and gave way under me. That is proof certain that the liquor went to my extremities and not to my head. Trust to a Scotchman's head for standing any amount of whisky. When the remains arrived at Auchimachi for interment, it was supposed that some mistake had been made. My hair is sandy, that of O'Hooligan is black, or nearly so, but there was no knowing what chemical action the alcohol might have on the hair in altering its colour. But my mother identified the legs past mistake, by a mole on the left calf and a varicose vein on the right. Anyhow, half a loaf is better than no bread, so all the mortal relics were consigned to the McAllister vault. It was aggravating to my feelings that the minister should pronounce a vara eloquent and moving discourse on the occasion over the trunk of a confounded Irishman and a papist. "You must really excuse me," interrupted I, "but how the dickens do you know all this?" "There is always an ethereal current of communication between the parts of a man's body," replied McAllister, "and there is spiritual intercommunication between a man's head and his toes, however parted they may be. I tell you, sir, in the spiritual world we know a thing or two. And now," said I, "what may be your wishes in this most unfortunate matter? I am coming to that if you'll exercise a little rational patience. This that I tell you of occurred in a considerable time ago. I shall be very pleased if, on your return to England, you will make it your business to run up to Scotland and interview my great-nephew. I am quite sure he will do the right thing by me, for the honour of the family, and to ease my soul. He never would have come into the estate at all, if it had not been for my lamented decease. There's another little unpleasantness to which I desire you to call his attention. A tombstone has been erected over my trunk and O'Hooligan's legs, here in this cemetery, and on it is, 'Sacred to the memory of Captain Timothy O'Hooligan, who fell on the field of glory, R.I.P.' Now this is liable to a misunderstanding, for it is me, I, to be grammatical, who lies underneath. I make no account of the Irishman's nether extremities, and being a convinced and zealous Presbyterian, I altogether conscientiously object to having requiescat in pace inscribed over my bodily remains, and my great-nephew, the present laird, if he be true to the principles of the covenant, will object just as strongly as myself. I know very well those letters are attached to the name of O'Hooligan, but they mark the place of deposition of my body rather than his, so I wish you just to put it clearly and logically to the laird, and he will take steps at any cost to have me transferred to Auchimachi. What he may do with the relics of that Irish rogue I don't care for, not one stick of barley sugar. I promised solemnly to fulfill the commission entrusted to me, and then Captain McAllister wished me a good night, and retired behind the cemetery wall. I did not quit the south of France that same year, for I spent the winter at Pau. In the following May I returned to England, and there found that a good many matters connected with my family called for my immediate attention. It was accordingly just a year and 5 months after my interview with Captain McAllister that I was able to discharge my promise. I had never forgotten my undertaking. I had merely postponed it. Charity begins at home, and my own concerns engrossed my time too fully to allow me the leisure for a trip to the north. However, in the end I did go. I took the express to Edinburgh. That city, I think candidly, is the finest for situation in the world, as far as I have seen of it. I did not then visit it. I never had previously been in the Athens of the North, and I should have liked to spend a couple of days at least in it, to look over the castle and to walk through Holyrood. But duty stands before pleasure, and I went on directly to my destination, postponing acquaintance with Edinburgh till I had accomplished my undertaking. I had written to Mr. Fergus McAllister to inform him of my desire to see him. I had not entered into the matter of my communication. I thought it best to leave this till I could tell him the whole story by word of mouth. I merely informed him by letter that I had something to speak to him about that greatly concerned his family. On reaching the station, his carriage awaited me, and I was driven to his house. He received me with the greatest cordiality, and offered me the kindest hospitality. The house was large and rambling, not in the best repair, and the grounds, as I was driven through them, did not appear to be trimly kept. I was introduced to his wife and to his 5 daughters, fair-haired, freckled girls, certainly not beautiful, but pleasing enough in manner. His eldest son was away in the army, and his second was in a lawyer's office in Edinburgh, so I saw nothing of them. After dinner, when the ladies had retired, I told him the entire story as freely and as fully as possible, and he listened to me with courtesy, patience, and the deepest attention. Yes, he said, when I had concluded, I was aware that doubts had been cast on the genuineness of the trunk, but under the circumstances it was considered advisable to allow the matter to stand as it was. There were insuperable difficulties in the way of an investigation and a certain identification, but the legs were all right. And I hope to show you tomorrow, in the kirk, a very handsome tablet against the wall, recording the name and the date of decease of my great-uncle, and some very laudatory words on his character, beside an appropriate text from the Scriptures. Now, however, that the facts are known, you will, of course, take steps for the translation of the half of Captain Alister to your family vault. I foresee considerable difficulties in the way, he replied. The authorities at Bayonne might raise objections to the exhuming of the remains in the grave marked by the tombstone of Captain O'Hooligan. They might very reasonably say, "What the hang has Mr. Fergus McAllister to do with the body of Captain O'Hooligan? We must consult the family of that officer in Ireland." "But," said I, "a representation of the case of the mistake made would render all clear to them. I do not see that there is any necessity for complicating the story by saying that you have only half of your relative here, and that the other half is in O'Hooligan's grave. State that orders had been given for the transmission of the body of your great-uncle to Auchimachie, and that, through error, the corpse of Captain O'Hooligan had been sent, and Captain McAllister buried by mistake as that of the Irishman. That makes a simple, intelligible, and straightforward tale. Then you could dispose of the superfluous legs when they arrived in the manner you think best." The laird remained silent for a while, rubbing his chin and looking at the tablecloth. Presently he stood up, and going to the sideboard said, "I'll just take a wash of whiskey to clear my thoughts. Will you have some?" "Thank you. I am enjoying your old and excellent port." Mr. Fergus McAllister returned leisurely to the table after his wash, remained silent a few minutes longer, then lifted his head and said, "I don't see that I am called upon to transport those legs." "No," I answered, "but you had best take the remains in a lump and sort them on their arrival. I am afraid it will be seriously expensive. My good sir, the property is not now worth what it was in Captain Alister's time. Land has gone down in value, and rents have been seriously reduced. Besides, farmers are now more exacting than formerly. They will not put up with the buyers that served their fathers. Then my son in the army is a great expense to me, and my second son is not yet earning his livelihood, and my daughters have not yet found suitors, so that I shall have to leave them something on which to live. Besides," he drew a long breath, "I want to build on to the house a billiard room. I do not think, protested I, "that the cost would be very serious." "What do you mean by serious?" he asked. "I think that these relics of humanity might be transported to Alkimashi in a hogshead of cognac, much as the others were." "What is the price of cognac down there?" asked he. "Well," I replied, "that is more than I can say as to the cask. Best cognac, 3 stars, is 5 francs 50 centimes a bottle. That's a long price. But 1 star? I cannot say, I never bought that. Possibly 3 francs and a half. And how many bottles to a cask? I am not sure, something over 200 litres. 203 shillings, mused Mr. Fergus, and then looking up. There is the duty in England, very heavy on spirits, and charges for the digging up, and fees to the officials, and the transport by water. He shook his head. You must remember, said I, that your relative is subjected to great indignities from those legs, getting towed 3 or 4 times round the enclosure. I said 3 or 4, but I believe it was only twice or thrice. It hardly comports with the family honour to suffer it. I think, replied Mr. Fergus, that you said it was but the spiritual presentment of a boot, and that there was no physical inconvenience felt, only a spiritual impression. Just so. For my part, judging from my personal experience, said the laird, spiritual impressions are most evanescent. Then, said I, Captain Alistair's trunk lies in a foreign land. But not, replied he, in Roman Catholic consecrated soil. That is a great satisfaction. You, however, have the trunk of a Roman Catholic in your family vault. It is so, according to what you say. But there are a score of McAllisters there, all staunch Presbyterians, and if it came to an argument among them, I won't say he would not have a leg to stand on, as he hasn't those anyhow, but he would find himself just nowhere. Then Mr. Fergus McAllister stood up and said, Shall we join the ladies? As to what you have said, sir, and have recommended, I assure you that I will give it my most serious consideration. Chapter 4. The Leaden Ring. It is not possible, Julia. I cannot conceive how the idea of attending the county ball can have entered your head after what has happened. Poor young Hattersley's dreadful death suffices to stop that. But, aunt, Mr. Hattersley is no relation of ours. No relation. But you know that the poor fellow would not have shot himself if it had not been for you. Oh, Aunt Elizabeth, how can you say so, when the verdict was that he committed suicide when in an unsound condition of mind? How could I help his blowing out his brains when those brains were deranged? Julia, do not talk like this. If he did go off his head, it was you who upset him by first drawing him on, leading him to believe that you liked him, and then throwing him over so soon as the Honourable James Lawler appeared on the tapis. Consider, what will people say if you go to the assembly? What will they say if I do not go? They will immediately set it down to my caring deeply for James Hattersley, and they will think that there was some sort of engagement. They are not likely to suppose that. But really, Julia, you were for a while all smiles and encouragement. Tell me now, did Mr. Hattersley propose to you? Well, yes, he did, and I refused him. And then he went and shot himself in despair. Julia, you cannot with any face go to the ball. Nobody knows that he proposed. And precisely because I do go, everyone will conclude that he did not propose. I do not wish it to be supposed that he did. His family, of course, must have been aware. They will see your name among those present at the assembly. Aunt, they are in too great trouble to look at the paper to see who were at the dance. His terrible death lies at your door. How you can have the heart, Julia. I don't see it, of course I feel it. I am awfully sorry, and awfully sorry for his father, the Admiral. I cannot set him up again. I wish that when I rejected him he had gone and done, as did Joe Pomeroy, marry one of his landlady's daughters. There, Julia, is another of your delinquencies. You lured on young Pomeroy till he proposed, then you refused him, and in a fit of vexation and mortified vanity he married a girl greatly beneath him in social position. If the menage prove a failure, you will have it on your conscience that you have wrecked his life, and perhaps hers as well. I cannot throw myself away as a charity to save this man or that from doing a foolish thing. What I complain of, Julia, is that you encouraged young Mr. Pomeroy till Mr. Hattersley appeared, whom you thought more eligible, and then you tossed him aside. And you did precisely the same with James Hattersley, as soon as you came to know Mr. Lawler. After all, Julia, I am not so sure that Mr. Pomeroy has not chosen the better part. The girl, I dare say, is simple, fresh, and affectionate. Your implication is not complimentary, Aunt Elizabeth. My dear, I have no patience with the young lady of the present day who is shallow, self-willed, and indifferent to the feelings and happiness of others, who craves for excitement and pleasure, and desires nothing that is useful and good. Where now will you see a girl like Viola's sister, who let concealment, like a worm i' the bud, feed on her damask cheek? Nowadays a girl lays herself at the feet of a man if she likes him, turns herself inside out, to let him and all the world read her heart. I have no relish to be like Viola's sister, and have my story a blank. I never grovelled at the feet of Joe Pomeroy or James Hattersley. No, but you led each to consider himself the favoured one till he proposed, and then you refused him. It was like smiling at a man and then stabbing him to the heart. Well, I don't want people to think that James Hattersley cared for me. I certainly never cared for him, nor that he proposed, so I shall go to the ball. Julia Demant was an orphan. She had been retained at school till she was 18, and then had been removed just at the age when a girl begins to take an interest in her studies, and not to regard them as drudgery. On her removal she had cast away all that she had acquired, and had been plunged into the whirl of society. Then suddenly her father died. She had lost her mother some years before, and she went to live with her aunt, Miss Fleming. Julia had inherited a sum of about £500 a year, and would probably come in for a good estate and funds as well on the death of her aunt. She had been flattered as a girl at home, and at school as a beauty, and she certainly thought no small bones of herself. Miss Fleming was an elderly lady with a sharp tongue, very outspoken, and very decided in her opinions. But her action was weak, and Julia soon discovered that she could bend the aunt to do anything she willed, though she could not modify or alter her opinions. In the matter of Joe Pomeroy and James Hattersley, it was as Miss Fleming had said. Julia had encouraged Mr. Pomeroy, and had only cast him off because she thought better of the suit of Mr. Hattersley, son of an admiral of that name. She had seen a good deal of young Hattersley, had given him every encouragement, had so entangled him that he was madly in love with her, and then, when she came to know the Honourable James Lawler, and saw that he was fascinated, she rejected Hattersley with the consequences alluded to in the conversation above given. Julia was particularly anxious to be present at the county ball, for she had been already booked by Mr. Lawler for several dances, and she was quite resolved to make an attempt to bring him to a declaration. On the evening of the ball, Miss Fleming and Julia entered the carriage. The aunt had given way, as was her wont, but under protest. For about 10 minutes neither spoke, and then Miss Fleming said, "Well, you know my feelings about this dance. I do not approve. I distinctly disapprove. I do not consider your going to the ball in good taste, or, as you would put it, in good form. Poor young Hattersley. Oh, dear aunt, do let us put young Hattersley aside. He was buried with the regular forms, I suppose?" "Yes, Julia." Then the rector accepted the verdict of the jury at the inquest. Why should not we? A man who is unsound in his mind is not responsible for his actions, and I suppose not. Much less, then, I who live 10 miles away. I do not say that you are responsible for his death, but for the condition of mind that led him to do the dreadful deed. Really, Julia, you are one of those into whose head or heart, only by a surgical operation, could the thought be introduced that you could be in the wrong. A hypodermic syringe would be too weak an instrument to effect such a radical change in you. Everyone else may be in the wrong, you never. As for me, I cannot get young Hattersley out of my head." "And I," retorted Julia with asperity, for her aunt's words had stung her, "I, for my part, do not give him a thought." She had hardly spoken the words before a chill wind began to pass round her. She drew the bearer shawl that was over her bare shoulders closer about her, and said, "Auntie, is the glass down on your side?" "No, Julia, why do you ask?" "There is such a draught." "Draught? I do not feel one. Perhaps the window on your side hitches." "Indeed, that is all right. It is blowing harder and is deadly cold." "Can one of the front panes be broken?" No, Rogers would have told me had that been the case. Besides, I can see that they are sound. The wind of which Julia complained swirled and whistled about her. It increased in force. It plucked at her shawl and slewed it about her throat. It tore at the lace on her dress. It snatched at her hair. It wrenched it away from the pins, the combs that held it in place. One long tress was lashed across the face of Miss Fleming. Then the hair, completely released, eddied up above the girl's head, and next moment was carried as a drift before her, blinding her. Then a sudden explosion, as though a gun had been fired into her ear, and with a scream of terror she sank back among the cushions. Miss Fleming, in great alarm, pulled the check string, and the carriage stopped. The footman descended from the box and came to the side. The old lady drew down the window and said, "Oh, Phillips, bring the lamp. Something has happened to Miss Demant." The man obeyed and sent a flood of light into the carriage. Julia was lying back, white and senseless. Her hair was scattered over her face, neck and shoulders. The flowers that had been stuck in it, the pins that had fastened it in place, the pads that had given shape to the convolutions lay strewn, some on her lap, some in the rug at the bottom of the carriage. "Phillips," ordered the old lady in great agitation, "tell Rogers to turn the horses and drive home at once, and do you run as fast as you can for Dr. Crate." A few minutes after the carriage was again in motion, Julia revived. Her aunt was chafing her hand. "Oh, Aunt," she said, "are all the glasses broken?" "Broken what glasses?" "Those of the carriage with the explosion." "Explosion, my dear?" "Yes, that gun which was discharged. It stunned me." "Were you hurt?" "I heard no gun, no explosion, but I did. It was as though a bullet had been discharged into my brain. I wonder that I escaped. Who can have fired at us?" "My dear, no one fired. I heard nothing. I know what it was. I had the same experience many years ago. I slept in a damp bed and awoke stone deaf in my right ear. I remained so for 3 weeks. But one night when I was at a ball and was dancing, all at once I heard a report as of a pistol in my right ear, and immediately heard quite clearly again. It was wax. But, Aunt Elizabeth, I have not been deaf." "You have not noticed that you were deaf." "Oh, but look at my hair. It was that wind that blew it about." "You are laboring under a delusion, Julia. There was no wind. But look, feel how my hair is down. That has been done by the motion of the carriage. There are many ruts in the road." They reached home, and Julia, feeling sick, frightened and bewildered, retired to bed. Dr. Crate arrived, said that she was hysterical, and ordered something to soothe her nerves. Julia was not convinced. The explanation offered by Miss Fleming did not satisfy her. That she was a victim to hysteria she did not in the least believe. Neither her aunt, nor the coachman, nor Phillips had heard the discharge of a gun. As to the rushing wind, Julia was satisfied that she had experienced it. The lace was ripped, as by a hand, from her dress, and the shawl was twisted about her throat. Besides, her hair had not been so slightly arranged that the jolting of the carnage would completely disarrange it. She was vastly perplexed over what she had undergone. She thought and thought, but could get no nearer to a solution of the mystery. Next day, as she was almost herself again, she rose and went about as usual. In the afternoon, the Honourable James Lawler called and asked after Miss Fleming. The butler replied that his mistress was out making calls, but that Miss Demant was at home, and he believed was on the terrace. Mr. Lawler at once asked to see her. He did not find Julia in the parlour or on the terrace, but in a lower garden to which she had descended to feed the goldfish in the pond. "Oh, Miss Demant," said he, "I was so disappointed not to see you at the ball last night. I was very unwell. I had a fainting fit and could not go. It threw a damp on our spirits. That is to say, on mine. I had you booked for several dances. You were able to give them to others. But that was not the same to me. I did an act of charity and self-denial. I danced instead with the ugly Miss Bergens and with Miss Pounding, and that was like dragging about a sack of potatoes. I believe it would have been a jolly evening, but for that shocking affair of young Hattersley which kept some of the better sort away. I mean those who know the Hattersleys. Of course, for me that did not matter. We were not acquainted. I never even spoke with the fellow. You knew him, I believe. I heard some people say so, and that you had not come because of him. The supper, for a subscription ball, was not atrociously bad. What did they say of me? Oh, if you will know that you did not attend the ball because you liked him very much and were awfully cut up. What a shame that people should talk. I never cared a rush for him. He was nice enough in his way, not a bounder, but tolerable as young men go. Mr. Lawler laughed. I should not relish to have such a qualified estimate made of me. Nor need you. You are interesting. He became so only when he had shot himself. It will be by this alone that he will be remembered. But there is no smoke without fire. Did he like you much? Dear Mr. Lawler, I am not a clairvoyante, and never was able to see into the brains or hearts of people, least of all of young men. Perhaps it is fortunate for me that I cannot. One lady told me that he had proposed to you. Who was that? The potato sack. I will not give her name. Is there any truth in it? Did he? No. At the moment she spoke, there sounded in her ear a whistle of wind, and she felt a current like a cord of ice creep round her throat. Increasing in force and compression, her hat was blown off, and next instant a detonation rang through her head as though a gun had been fired into her ear. She uttered a cry and sank upon the ground, through her head as though a gun had been fired into her ear. James Lawler was bewildered. His first impulse was to run to the house for assistance. Then he considered that he could not leave her lying on the wet soil, and he stooped to raise her in his arms and to carry her within. In novels, young men perform such a feat without difficulty, but in fact they are not able to do it, especially when the girl is tall and big-boned. Moreover, one in a faint is a dead weight. Lawler staggered under his burden to the steps. It was as much as he could perform to carry her up to the terrace, and there he placed her on a seat. Panting, and with his muscles quivering after the strain, he hastened to the drawing-room, rang the bell, and when the butler appeared, he gasped, "Miss Demant has fainted. You and I and the footman must carry her within. She fainted last night in the carriage," said the butler. When Julia came to her senses, she was in bed attended by the housekeeper and her maid. A few moments later, Miss Fleming arrived. "Oh, Aunt, I have heard it again." "Heard what, dear?" "The discharge of a gun. It is nothing but wax," said the old lady. "I will drop a little sweet oil into your ear, and then have it syringed with warm water. I want to tell you something in private." Miss Fleming signed to the servants to withdraw. "Aunt," said the girl, "I must say something. This is the second time that this has happened. I am sure it is significant. James Lawler was with me in the sunken garden, and he began to speak about James Hattersley. You know, it was when we were talking about him last night that I heard that awful noise. It was precisely as if a gun had been discharged into my ear. I felt as if all the nerves and tissues of my head were being torn, and all the bones of my skull shattered, just what Mr. Hattersley must have undergone when he pulled the trigger. It was an agony for a moment, perhaps, but it felt as if it lasted an hour. Mr. Lawler had asked me point-blank if James Hattersley had proposed to me, and I said no. I was perfectly justified in so answering, because he had no right to ask me such a question. It was an impertinence on his part, and I answered him shortly and sharply with a negative. But actually, James Hattersley proposed twice to me. He would not accept a first refusal, but came next day bothering me again, and I was pretty curt with him. He made some remarks that were rude about how I had treated him, and which I will not repeat, and as he left in a state of great agitation, he said, "Julia, I vow that you shall not forget this, and you shall belong to no one but me, alive or dead." I considered this great nonsense, and did not accord it another thought. But really, these terrible annoyances, this wind and the bursts of noise, do seem to me to come from him. It is just as though he felt a malignant delight in distressing me, now that he is dead. I should like to defy him, and I will do it if I can, but I cannot bear more of these experiences. They will kill me. Several days elapsed. Mr. Lawler called repeatedly to inquire, but a week passed before Julia was sufficiently recovered to receive him, and then the visit was one of courtesy and of sympathy, and the conversation turned upon her health, and on indifferent themes. But some few days later it was otherwise. She was in the conservatory alone, pretty much herself again, when Mr. Lawler was announced. Physically she had recovered, or believed that she had, but her nerves had actually received a severe shock. She had made up her mind that the phenomena of the circling wind and the explosion were in some mysterious manner connected with Hattersley. She bitterly resented this, but she was in mortal terror of a recurrence, and she felt no compunction for her treatment of the unfortunate young man, but rather a sense of deep resentment against him. If he were dead, why did he not lie quiet and cease from vexing her? To be a martyr was to her no gratification, for hers was not a martyrdom that provoked sympathy and which could make her interesting. She had hitherto supposed that when a man died, there was an end of him. His condition was determined for good or for ill, but that a disembodied spirit should hover about and make itself a nuisance to the living had never entered into her calculations. "Julia, if I may be allowed so to call you," began Mr. Lawler, "I have brought you a bouquet of flowers. Will you accept them?" "Oh," she said, as he handed the bunch to her. "How kind of you. At this time of the year they are so rare, and Aunt's gardener is so miserly that he will spare me none for my room but some miserable bits of geranium. It is too bad of you wasting your money like this upon me." "It is no waste, if it affords you pleasure." "It is a pleasure. I dearly love flowers." "To give you pleasure," said Mr. Lawler, "is the great object of my life. If I could assure you happiness, if you would allow me to hope to seize this opportunity, now that we are alone together." He drew near and caught her hand. His features were agitated, his lips trembled, there was earnestness in his eyes. At once a cold blast touched Julia and began to circle about her and to flutter her hair. She trembled and drew back. That paralyzing experience was about to be renewed. She turned deadly white and put her hand to her right ear. "Oh, James, James," she gasped. Pray do not speak what you want to say, or I shall faint. It is coming on. I am not yet well enough to hear it. Write to me and I will answer. For pity's sake do not speak it." Then she sank upon a seat, and at that moment her aunt entered the conservatory. On the following day a note was put into her hand containing a formal proposal from the Honourable James Lawler, and by return of post Julia answered with an acceptance. There was no reason whatever why the engagement should be long, and the only alternative mooted was whether the wedding should take place before Lent or after Easter. Finally, it was settled that it should be celebrated on Shrove Tuesday. This left a short time for the necessary preparations. Miss Fleming would have to go to town with her niece concerning a trousseau, and a trousseau is not turned out rapidly any more than an armed cruiser. There is usually a certain period allowed to young people who have become engaged, to see much of each other, to get better acquainted with one another, to build their castles in the air, and to indulge in little passages of affection, vulgarly called spooning. But in this case the spooning had to be curtailed and postponed. At the outset, when alone with James, Julia was nervous. She feared a recurrence of those phenomena that so affected her. But although every now and then the wind curled and soft about her, it was not violent, nor was it chilling, and she came to regard it as a wail of discomfiture. Moreover, there was no recurrence of the detonation, and she fondly hoped that with her marriage the vexation would completely cease. In her heart was deep down a sense of exultation. She was defying James Hattersley and setting his prediction at naught. She was not in love with Mr. Lawler. She liked him, in her cold manner, and was not insensible to the social advantage that would be hers when she became the Honourable Mrs. Lawler. The day of the wedding arrived. Happily it was fine. "Blessed is the bride the sun shines on," said the cheery Miss Fleming, "an omen, I trust, of a bright and unruffled life in your new condition." All the neighbourhood was present at the church. Miss Fleming had many friends. Mr. Lawler had fewer present, as he belonged to a distant county. The church path had been laid with red cloth, the church decorated with flowers, and a choir was present to twitter, "The voice that breathed o'er Eden." The rector stood by the altar, and 2 cushions had been laid at the chancel step. The rector was to be assisted by an uncle of the bridegroom, who was in holy orders. The rector, being old-fashioned, had drawn on pale grey kid gloves. First arrived the bridegroom with his best man, and stood in a nervous condition, balancing himself first on one foot, then on the other, waiting, observed by all eyes. Next entered the procession of the bride, attended by her maids, to the wedding march in Lohengrin, on a wheezy organ. Then Julia and her intended took their places at the chancel step for the performance of the first portion of the ceremony, and the two clergy descended to them from the altar. "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" "I will." "Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband?" "I will." "I, James, take thee, Julia, to my wedded wife, to have and to hold," and so on. As the words were being spoken, a cold rush of air passed over the clasped hands, numbing them, and began to creep round the bride, and to flutter her veil. She set her lips and knitted her brows. In a few minutes she would be beyond the reach of these manifestations. When it came to her turn to speak, she began firmly, "I, Julia, take thee, James." But as she proceeded, the wind became fierce. It raged about her. It caught her veil on one side and buffeted her cheek. It switched the veil about her throat, as though strangling her with a drift of snow contracting into ice. But she persevered to the end. Then James Lawler produced the ring, and was about to place it on her finger with the prescribed words, "With this ring I thee wed," when a report rang in her ear, followed by a heaving of her skull, as though the bones were being burst asunder, and she sank unconscious on the chancel step. In the midst of profound commotion, she was raised and conveyed to the vestry, followed by James Lawler, trembling and pale. He had slipped the ring back into his waistcoat pocket. Dr. Crate, who was present, hastened to offer his professional assistance. In the vestry, Julia rested in a Glastonbury chair, white and still, with her hands resting in her lap. And to the amazement of those present, it was seen that on the third finger of her left hand was a leaden ring, rude and solid as though fashioned out of a bullet. Restoratives were applied, but full a quarter of an hour elapsed before Julia opened her eyes, and a little colour returned to her lips and cheek. But, as she raised her hands to her brow to wipe away the damps that had formed on it, her eye caught sight of the leaden ring, and with a cry of horror she sank again into insensibility. The congregation slowly left the church, awestruck, whispering, asking questions, receiving no satisfactory answers, forming surmises all incorrect. "I am very much afraid, Mr. Lawler," said the rector, "that it will be impossible to proceed with the service today. It must be postponed till Miss Demant is in a condition to conclude her part and to sign the register. I do not see how it can be gone on with today. She is quite unequal to the effort." The carriage which was to have conveyed the couple to Miss Fleming's house and then later to have taken them to the station for their honeymoon, the horses decorated with white rosettes, the whip adorned with a white bow, had now to convey Julia, hardly conscious, supported by her aunt, to her home. No rice could be thrown. The bell-ringers, prepared to give a joyous peal, were constrained to depart. The reception at Miss Fleming's was postponed. No one thought of attending. The cakes, the ices, were consumed in the kitchen. The bridegroom, bewildered, almost frantic, ran hither and thither, not knowing what to do, what to say. Julia lay as a stone for fully 2 hours, and when she came to herself could not speak. When conscious, she raised her left hand, looked on the leaden ring, and sank back again into senselessness. Not till late in the evening was she sufficiently recovered to speak, and then she begged her aunt, who had remained by her bed without stirring, to dismiss the attendants. She desired to speak with her alone. When no one was in the room with her, save Miss Fleming, she said in a whisper, "Oh, Aunt Elizabeth! Oh, Auntie! Such an awful thing has happened. I can never marry Mr. Lawler, never. I have married James Hattersley. I am a dead man's wife." At the time that James Lawler was making the responses, I heard a piping voice in my ear, an unearthly voice, saying the same words. When I said, "I, Julia, take you, James, to my wedded husband," you know Mr. Hattersley is James as well as Mr. Lawler. Then the words applied to him as much or as well as to the other. And then, when it came to the giving of the ring, there was the explosion in my ear, as before, and the leaden ring was forced onto my finger, and not James Lawler's golden ring. It is of no use my resisting any more. I am a dead man's wife, and I cannot marry James Lawler. Some years have elapsed since that disastrous day and that incomplete marriage. Mr. Mant is Mr. Mant still, and she has never been able to remove the leaden ring from the third finger of her left hand. Whenever the attempt has been made, either to disengage it by drawing it off or by cutting through it, there has ensued that terrifying discharge as of a gun into her ear, causing insensibility. The prostration that has followed, the terror it has inspired, have so affected her nerves that she has desisted from every attempt to rid herself of the ring. She invariably wears a glove on her left hand, and it is bulged over the third finger, where lies that leaden ring. She is not a happy woman, although her aunt is dead and has left her a handsome estate. She has not got many acquaintances. She has no friends, for her temper is unamiable and her tongue is bitter. She supposes that the world, as far as she knows it, is in league against her. Towards the memory of James Hattersley she entertains a deadly hate. If an incantation could lay his spirit, if prayer could give him repose, she would have recourse to none of these expedients, even though they might relieve her. So bitter is her resentment, and she harbours a silent wrath against Providence for allowing the dead to walk and to molest the living. Chapter 5. The Mother of Pansies. Anna Voss of Siebenstein was the prettiest girl in her village. Never was she absent from a fair or a dance. No one ever saw her abroad anything but merry. If she had her fits of bad temper, she kept them for her mother, in the secrecy of the house. Her voice was like that of the lark, and her smile like the May morning. She had plenty of suitors, for she was possessed of what a young peasant desires more in a wife than beauty, and that is money. But of all the young men who hovered about her and sought her favour, none was destined to win it save Joseph Arler, the ranger, a man in a government position, whose duty was to watch the frontier against smugglers, and to keep an eye on the game against poachers. The eve of the marriage had come. One thing weighed on the pleasure-loving mind of Anna. She dreaded becoming a mother of a family which would keep her at home, and occupy her from morn to eve in attendance on her children, and break the sweetness of her sleep at night. So she visited an old hag named Schandelwein, who was a reputed witch, and to whom she confided her trouble. The old woman said that she had looked into the mirror of destiny before Anna arrived, and she had seen that Providence had ordained that Anna should have 7 children, 3 girls and 4 boys, and that one of the latter was destined to be a priest. But Mother Schandelwein had great powers. She could set at naught the determinations of Providence, and she gave to Anna 7 pips, very much like apple pips, which she placed in a cornet of paper, and she bade her cast these one by one into the mill race, and as each went over the mill wheel, it ceased to have a future, and in each pip was a child's soul. So Anna put money into Mother Schandelwein's hand and departed, and when it was growing dusk she stole to the wooden bridge over the mill stream and dropped in 1 pip after another. As each fell into the water she heard a little sigh, but when it came to casting in the last of the 7, she felt a sudden qualm and a battle in her soul. However, she threw it in, and then, overcome by an impulse of remorse, threw herself into the stream to recover it, and as she did so she uttered a cry. But the water was dark, the floating pip was small, she could not see it, and the current was rapidly carrying her to the mill wheel, when the miller ran out and rescued her. On the following morning she had completely recovered her spirits, and laughingly told her bridesmaids how that in the dusk, in crossing the wooden bridge, her foot had slipped, she had fallen into the stream, and had been nearly drowned. And then, added she, if I really had been drowned, what would Joseph have done? The married life of Anna was not unhappy. It could hardly be that in association with so genial, kind, and simple a man as Joseph. But it was not altogether the ideal happiness anticipated by both. Joseph had to be much away from home, sometimes for days and nights together, and Anna found it very tedious to be alone, and Joseph might have calculated on a more considerate wife. After a hard day of climbing and chasing in the mountains, he might have expected that she would have a good hot supper ready for him, but Anna set before him whatever came to hand and cost least trouble. A healthy appetite is the best of sauces, she remarked. Moreover, the nature of his avocation, scrambling up rocks and breaking through an undergrowth of brambles and thorns, produced rents and fraying of stockings and cloth garments. Instead of cheerfully undertaking the repairs, Anna grumbled over each rent and put out his garments to be mended by others. It was only when repair was urgent that she consented to undertake it herself, and then it was done with sulky looks, muttered reproaches, and was executed so badly that it had to be done over again, and by a hired workwoman. But Joseph's nature was so amiable, and he was so fond of his pretty wife, that he bore with those defects and turned off her murmurs with a joke, or sealed her pouting lips with a kiss. There was one thing about Joseph that Anna could not relish. Whenever he came into the village, he was surrounded, besieged by the children. Hardly had he turned the corner into the square before it was known that he was there, and the little ones burst out of their parents' houses, broke from their sister nurse's arms, to scamper up to Joseph and to jump about him. For Joseph somehow always had nuts or almonds or sweets in his pockets, and for these he made the children leap, or catch or scramble, or sometimes beg, by putting a sweet on a boy's nose and bidding him hold it there, till he said, "Catch." Joseph had one particular favourite among all this crew, and that was a little lame boy with a white, pinched face who hobbled about on crutches. Him Joseph would single out, take him on his knee, seat himself on the steps of the village cross or of the churchyard, and tell him stories of his adventures, of the habits of the beasts of the forest. Anna, looking out of her window, could see all this, and see how before Joseph set the poor cripple down, the child would throw its arms round his neck and kiss him. Then Joseph would come home with his swinging step and joyous face. Anna resented that his first attention should be given to the children, regarding it as her due, and she often showed her displeasure by the chill of her reception of her husband. She did not reproach him in set words, but she did not run to meet him, jump into his arms and respond to his warm kisses. Once he did venture on a mild expostulation. "Anna, why do you not knit my socks or stocking legs? Homemade is heart-made. It is a pity to spend money on buying what is poor stuff, when those made by you would not only last on my calves and feet, but warm the cockles of my heart." To which she replied testily, "It is you who set the example of throwing money away on sweet things for those pestilent little village brats." One evening, Anna heard an unusual hubbub in the square, shouts and laughter, not of children alone, but of women and men as well, and next moment into the house burst Joseph very red, carrying a cradle on his head. "What is this fooling for?" asked Anna, turning crimson. "An experiment, Anna, dearest," answered Joseph, setting down the cradle. "I have heard it said that a wife who rocks an empty cradle soon rocks a baby into it, so I have bought this and brought it to you. Rock, 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 and when I see a little rosebud in it among the snowy linen, I shall cry for joy." Never before had Anna known how dull and dead life could be in an empty house. When she had lived with her mother, that mother had made her do much of the necessary work of the house. Now there was not much to be done, and there was no one to exercise compulsion. If Anna ran out and visited her neighbours, they proved to be disinclined for a gossip. During the day they had to scrub and bake and cook, and in the evening they had their husbands and children with them, and did not relish the intrusion of a neighbour. The days were weary days, and Anna had not the energy or the love of work to prompt her to occupy herself more than was absolutely necessary. Consequently, the house was not kept scrupulously clean. The glass and the pewter and the saucepans did not shine. The window panes were dull. The house linen was unhemmed. One evening Joseph sat in a meditative mood over the fire, looking into the red embers, and what was unusual with him, he did not speak. Anna was inclined to take umbrage at this, when all at once he looked round at her with his bright, pleasant smile, and said, "Anna, I have been thinking. One thing is wanted to make us supremely happy, a baby in the house. It has not pleased God to send us one, so I propose that we both go on pilgrimage to Mariahilf to ask for one." "Go yourself, I want no baby here," retorted Anna. A few days after this, like a thunderbolt out of a clear sky, came the great affliction on Anna of her husband's death. Joseph had been found shot in the mountains. He was quite dead. The bullet had pierced his heart. He was brought home borne on green fir boughs interlaced by 4 fellow Jaegers, and they carried him into his house. He had, in all probability, met his death at the hand of smugglers. With a cry of horror and grief, Anna threw herself on Joseph's body and kissed his pale lips. Now only did she realize how deeply all along she had loved him, now that she had lost him. Joseph was laid in his coffin preparatory to the interment on the morrow. A crucifix and 2 candles stood at his head on a little table covered with a white cloth. On a stool at his feet was a bowl containing holy water and a sprig of rue. A neighbor had volunteered to keep company with Anna during the night, but she had impatiently, without speaking, repelled the offer. She would spend the last night that he was above ground alone with her dead, alone with her thoughts. And what were those thoughts? Now she remembered how indifferent she had been to his wishes, how careless of his comforts, how little she had valued his love, had appreciated his cheerfulness, his kindness, his forbearance, his equable temper. Now she recalled studied coldness on her part, sharp words, mortifying gestures, outbursts of unreasoning and unreasonable petulance. Now she recalled Joseph scattering nuts among the children, addressing kind words to old crones, giving wholesome advice to giddy youths. She remembered now little endearments shown to her, the presents brought her from the fair, the efforts made to cheer her with his pleasant stories and quaint jokes. She heard again his cheerful voice as he strove to interest her in his adventures of the chase. As she thus sat silent, numbed by her sorrow, in the faint light cast by the 2 candles, with the shadow of the coffin lying black on the floor at her feet, she heard a stumping without. Then a hand was laid on the latch, the door was timidly opened, and in upon his crutches came the crippled boy. He looked wistfully at her, but she made no sign, and then he hobbled to the coffin and burst into tears and stooped and kissed the brow of his dead friend. Leaning on his crutches, he took his rosary and said the prayers for the rest of her and his Joseph's soul, then shuffled awkwardly to the foot, dipped the spray of rue, and sprinkled the dead with the blessed water. Next moment the ungainly creature was stumping forth, but after he had passed through the door, he turned, looked once more towards the dead, put his hand to his lips, and wafted to it his final farewell. Anna now took her beads and tried to pray, but her prayers would not leave her lips. They were choked and driven back by the thoughts which crowded up and bewildered her. The chain fell from her fingers upon her lap, lay there neglected, and then slipped to the floor. How the time passed she knew not, neither did she care. The clock ticked, and she heard it not. The hours sounded, and she regarded them not till in at her ear, and through her brain came clear the call of the wooden cuckoo announcing midnight. Her eyes had been closed. Now suddenly she was roused, and they opened and saw that all was changed. The coffin was gone, but by her instead was the cradle that years ago Joseph had brought home, and which she had chopped up for firewood. And now in that cradle lay a babe asleep, and with her foot she rocked it, and found a strange comfort in so doing. She was conscious of no sense of surprise, only a great welling up of joy in her heart. Presently she heard a feeble whimper, and saw a stirring in the cradle. Little hands were put forth gropingly. Then she stooped and lifted the child to her lap, and clasped it to her heart. Oh, how lovely was that tiny creature! Oh, how sweet in her ears its appealing cry! As she held it to her bosom, the warm hands touched her throat, and the little lips were pressed to her bosom. She pressed it to her. She had entered into a new world, a world of love and light and beauty and happiness unspeakable. Oh, the babe, the babe, the babe! She laughed and cried and laughed and sobbed for very exuberance of joy. It brought warmth to her heart. It made every vein tingle. It ingrained her brain with pride. It was hers, her own, her very own. She could have been content to spend an eternity thus, with that little one close to her heart. Then, as suddenly all faded away, the child in her arms was gone as a shadow, her tears congealed, her heart was cramped, and a voice spoke within her. It is not because you would not. You cast the soul away, and it went over the mill wheel. Wild with terror, Uttering a despairing cry, she started up, straining her arms after the lost child and grasping nothing. She looked about her. The light of the candles flickered over the face of her dead Joseph. And tick, tick, tick went the clock. She could endure this no more. She opened the door to leave the room and stepped into the outer chamber and cast herself into a chair. And lo, it was no more night. The sun, the red evening sun, shone in at the window, and on the sill were pots of pinks and mignonette that filled the air with fragrance. And there at her side stood a little girl with shining fair hair, and the evening sun was on it like the glory about a saint. The child raised its large blue eyes to her, pure innocent eyes, and said, "Mother, may I say my catechism and prayers before I go to bed?" Then Anna answered and said, "Oh, my darling, my dearest Barbchen, all the catechism is comprehended in this: love God, fear God, always do what is your duty, do His will, and do not seek only your own pleasure and ease, and this will give you peace, peace, peace." The little girl knelt and laid her golden head on her folded hands upon Anna's knee and began, "God bless dear father, and mother, and all my dear brothers and sisters." Instantly a sharp pang as a knife went through the heart of Anna, and she cried, "Thou hast no father and no mother and no brothers and no sisters, for thou art not, because I would not have thee. I cast away thy soul, and it went over the mill wheel." The cuckoo called one. The child had vanished, but the door was thrown open, and in the doorway stood a young couple, one, a youth with fair hair, and the down of a moustache on his lip, and oh, in face so like to the dead Joseph. He held by the hand a girl, in black bodice and with white sleeves, looking modestly on the ground. At once Anna knew what this signified. It was her son Florian come to announce that he was engaged, and to ask his mother's sanction. Then said the young man, as he came forward leading the girl, "Mother, sweetest mother, this is Susie, the baker's daughter, and child of your old and dear friend Vroni. We love one another. We have loved since we were little children together at school, and did our lessons out of one book, sitting on one bench. And mother, the bakehouse is to be passed on to me and to Susie, and I shall bake for all the parish." The good Jesus fed the multitude, distributing the loaves through the hands of his apostles. "And I shall be his minister, feeding his people here. Mother, give us your blessing." Then Florian and the girl knelt to Anna, and with tears of happiness in her eyes, she raised her hands over them. But ere she could touch them, all had vanished. The room was dark, and a voice spake within her, "There is no Florian. There would have been, but you would not. You cast his soul into the water, and it passed away for ever over the mill wheel." In an agony of terror, Anna sprang from her seat. She could not endure the room. The air stifled her. Her brain was on fire. She rushed to the back door that opened on a kitchen garden, where grew the pot herbs and cabbages for use, tended by Joseph when he returned from his work in the mountains. But she came forth on a strange scene. She was on a battlefield. The air was charged with smoke and the smell of gunpowder, the roar of cannon and the rattle of musketry. The cries of the wounded and shouts of encouragement rang in her ears in a confused din. As she stood, panting, her hands to her breast, staring with wondering eyes, before her charged past a battalion of soldiers, and she knew by their uniforms that they were Bavarians. One of them, as he passed, turned his face towards her. It was the face of an Arler, fired with enthusiasm. She knew it. It was that of her son Fritz. Then came a withering volley, and many of the gallant fellows fell, among them he who carried the standard. Instantly Fritz snatched it from his hand, waved it over his head, shouted, "Charge, brothers, fill up the ranks. Charge, and the day is ours." Then the remnant closed up and went forward with bayonets fixed. Tramp, tramp. Again an explosion of firearms, and a dense cloud of smoke rolled before her, and she could not see the result. She waited, quivering in every limb, holding her breath, hoping, fearing, waiting. And as the smoke cleared, she saw men carrying to the rear one who had been wounded, and in his hand he grasped the flag. They laid him at Anna's feet, and she recognized that it was her Fritz. She fell on her knees, and snatching the kerchief from her throat and breast, strove to stanch the blood that welled from his heart. He looked up into her eyes with such love in them as made her choke with emotion, and he said faintly, "Mutterken, do not grieve for me. We have stormed the redoubt. The day is ours. Be of good cheer. They fly, those French rascals. Mother, remember me. I die for the dear fatherland." And a comrade standing by said, "Do not give way to your grief, Anna Arla. Your son has died the death of a hero." Then she stooped over him and saw the glaze of death in his eyes, and his lips moved. She bent her ear to them and caught the words, "I am not, because you would not. There is no Fritz. You cast my soul into the brook, and I was carried over the mill wheel." All passed away, the smell of the powder, the roar of the cannon, the volumes of smoke, the cry of the battle, all to a dead hush. Anna staggered to her feet and turned to go back to her cottage, and as she opened the door, heard the cuckoo call too. But, as she entered, she found herself to be, not in her own room and house. She had strayed into another, and she found herself not in a lone chamber, not in her desolate home, but in the midst of a strange family scene. A woman, a mother, was dying. Her head reposed on her husband's breast as he sat on the bed and held her in his arms. The man had grey hair. His face was overflowed with tears, and his eyes rested with an expression of devouring love on her, whom he supported, and whose brow he now and again bent over to kiss. About the bed were gathered her children, and also her grandchildren, quite young, looking on with solemn, wondering eyes on the last throes of her, whom they had learned to cling to and love with all the fervour of their simple hearts. One mite held her doll, dangling by the arm, and the forefinger of her other hand was in her mouth. Her eyes were brimming, and sobs came from her infant breast. She did not understand what was being taken from her, but she wept in sympathy with the rest. Kneeling by the bed was the eldest daughter of the expiring woman, reciting the litany of the dying, and the sons and another daughter and a daughter-in-law repeated the responses in voices broken with tears. When the recitation of the prayers ceased, there ensued for a while a great stillness, and all eyes rested on the dying woman. Her lips moved, and she poured forth her last petitions, that left her as rising flakes of fire, kindled by her pure and ardent soul. O God, comfort and bless my dear husband, and ever keep thy watchful guard over my children and my children's children, that they may walk in the way that leads to thee, and that in thine own good time we may all be gathered in thy paradise together, united for evermore. Amen. A spasm contracted Anna's heart. This woman with ecstatic, upturned gaze, this woman breathing forth her peaceful soul on her husband's breast, was her own daughter Elizabeth, and in the fine outline of her features was Joseph's profile. All again was hushed. The father slowly rose and quitted his position on the bed, gently laid the head on the pillow, put one hand over the eyes that still looked up to heaven, and with the fingers of the other tenderly arranged the straggling hair on each side of the brow. Then, standing and turning to the rest, with a subdued voice he said, "My children, it has pleased the Lord to take to himself your dear mother and my faithful companion. The Lord's will be done." Then ensued a great burst of weeping, and Anna's eyes brimmed till she could see no more. The church bell began to toll for a departing spirit, and following each stroke there came to her, as the after-clang of the boom, there has not been an Elizabeth. There would have been all this, but thou wouldest it not. For the soul of thy Elizabeth thou didst send down the mill-stream and over the wheel. Frantic with shame, with sorrow, not knowing what she did, or whither she went, Anna made for the front door of the house, ran forth and stood in the village square. To her unutterable amazement it was vastly changed. Moreover, the sun was shining brightly, and it gleamed over a new parish church, of cut white stone, very stately, with a gilded spire, with windows of wondrous lacework. Flags were flying, festoons of flowers hung everywhere. A triumphal arch of leaves and young birch trees was at the graveyard gate. The square was crowded with the peasants, all in their holiday attire. Silent, Anna stood and looked around, and as she stood, she heard the talk of the people about her. One said, It's a great thing that Johann von Ahle has done for his native village. But see, he is a good man, and he is a great architect. But why, asked another, do you call him von Ahle? He was the son of that Joseph the Jager who was killed by the smugglers in the mountains. That is true, but do you not know that the king has ennobled him? He has done such great things in the residence. He built the new town hall, which is thought to be the finest thing in Bavaria. He added a new wing to the palace, and he has rebuilt very many churches, and designed mansions for the rich citizens and the nobles. But although he is such a famous man, his heart is in the right place. He never forgets that he was born in Siebenstein. Look what a beautiful house he has built for himself and his family on the mountain side. He is there in summer, and it is furnished magnificently. But he will not suffer the old humble Ahle cottage here to be meddled with. They say that he values it above gold, and this is the new church he has erected in his native village. That is good. Oh, he is a good man, is Johann. He was always a good and serious boy, and never happy without a pencil in his hand. You mark what I say. Some day hence, when he is dead, there will be a statue erected in his honor here in this marketplace, to commemorate the one famous man that has been produced by Siebenstein. But see, here he comes to the dedication of the new church. Then, through the throng advanced a blond, middle-aged man, with broad forehead, clear, bright blue eyes, and a flowing light beard. All the men present plucked off their hats to him, and made way for him as he advanced. But full of smiles, he had a hand and a warm pressure, and a kindly word, and a question as to family concerns, for each who was near. All at once his eye encountered that of Anna. A flash of recognition and joy kindled it up, and extending his arms, he thrust his way towards her, crying, "My mother, my own mother." Then, just as she was about to be folded to his heart, all faded away, and a voice said in her soul, "He is no son of thine, Anna Ahle. He is not, because thou wouldest not. He might have been, God had so purposed, but thou madest his purpose of none effect. Thou didst send his soul over the mill-wheel." And then faintly, as from a far distance, sounded in her ear the call of the Cuckoo Three. The magnificent new church had shriveled up to the original mean little edifice Anna had known all her life. The square was deserted. The cold, faint glimmer of coming dawn was visible over the eastern mountain tops, but stars still shone in the sky. With a cry of pain, like a wounded beast, Anna ran hither and thither seeking a refuge, and then fled to the one home and resting place of the troubled soul, the church. She thrust open the swing door, pushed in, sped over the uneven floor, and flung herself on her knees before the altar. But see, before that altar stood a priest in a vestment of black and silver, and a serving boy knelt on his right hand on a lower stage. The candles were lighted, for the priest was about to say Mass. There was a rustling of feet, a sound as of people entering, and many were kneeling shortly after, on each side of Anna. And still they came on. She turned about and looked and saw a great crowd pressing in, and strange did it seem to her eyes that all men, women, and children, young and old, seemed to bear in their faces something, a trace only in many of the Ahle or the Voss features. And the little serving boy, as he shifted his position, showed her his profile. It was like her little brother who had died when he was 16. Then the priest turned himself about and said, "Oremus." And she knew him. He was her own son, her Joseph, named after his dear father. The Mass began and proceeded to the Sursum Corda, "Lift up your hearts." When the celebrant stood facing the congregation with extended arms and all responded, "We lift them up unto the Lord." But then, instead of proceeding with the accustomed invocation, he raised his hands high above his head, with the palms towards the congregation, and in a loud, stern voice exclaimed, "Cursed is the unfruitful field. Amen. Cursed is the barren tree. Amen. Cursed is the empty house. Amen. Cursed is the fishless lake. Amen." Forasmuch as Anna Ahle, born Voss, might have been the mother of countless generations, as the sand of the seashore for number, as the stars of heaven for brightness, of generations unto the end of time, even of all of us now gathered together here. But she would not, therefore shall she be alone, with none to comfort her. sick, with none to minister to her, broken in heart, with none to bind up her wounds, feeble, and none to stay her up, dead, and none to pray for her. For she would not. She shall have an unforgotten and unforgettable past, and have no future, remorse, but no hope. She shall have tears, but no laughter, for she would not. Woe, woe, woe! He lowered his hands, and the tapers were extinguished. The celebrant faded as a vision of the night. The server vanished as an incense cloud. The congregation disappeared, melting into shadows, and then from shadows to nothingness, without stirring from their places, and without a sound. And Anna, with a scream of despair, flung herself forward with her face on the pavement, and her hands extended. 2 years ago, during the first week in June, an English traveller arrived at Siebenstein and put up at the Krone, where, as he was tired and hungry, he ordered an early supper. When that was discussed, he strolled forth into the village square and leaned against the wall of the churchyard. The sun had set in the valley, but the mountain peaks were still in the glory of its rays, surrounding the place as a golden crown. He lighted a cigar, and looking into the cemetery, observed there an old woman, bowed over a grave, above which stood a cross, inscribed Joseph Arler, and she was tending the flowers on it, and laying over the arms of the cross a little wreath of heart's ease or pansy. She had in her hand a small basket. Presently she rose and walked towards the gate, by which stood the traveller. As she passed, he said kindly to her, "Grüß Gott, Mutterchen." She looked steadily at him and replied, "Honoured sir, that which is past may be repented of, but can never be undone," and went on her way. He was struck with her face. He had never before seen one so full of boundless sorrow, almost of despair. His eyes followed her as she walked towards the mill stream, and there she took her place on the wooden bridge that crossed it, leaning over the handrail and looking down into the water. An impulse of curiosity and of interest led him to follow her at a distance, and he saw her pick a flower, a pansy, out of her basket and drop it into the current, which caught and carried it forward. Then she took a second and allowed it to fall into the water. Then, after an interval, a third, a fourth, and he counted 7 in all. After that she bowed her head on her hands, her grey hair fell over them, and she broke into a paroxysm of weeping. The traveller, standing by the stream, saw the 7 pansies swept down, and one by one pass over the revolving wheel and vanish. He turned himself about to return to his inn, when, seeing a grave peasant near, he asked, "Who is that poor old woman who seems so broken down with sorrow?" "That," replied the man, "is the mother of pansies." "The mother of pansies," he repeated. "Well, it is the name she has acquired in the place. Actually, she is called Anna Arler and is a widow. She was the wife of one Joseph Arler, a Jaeger, who was shot by smugglers. But that is many, many years ago. She is not right in her head, but she is harmless. When her husband was brought home dead, she insisted on being left alone in the night by him, before he was buried alone with his coffin, and what happened in that night no one knows. Some affirm that she saw ghosts. I do not know. She may have had thoughts. The French word for these flowers is thoughts, and she will have none others. When they are in her garden, she collects them, and does as she has done now. When she has none, she goes about to her neighbours and begs them. She comes here every evening and throws in 7, just 7, no more and no less, and then weeps as one whose heart would split. My wife on one occasion offered her forget-me-nots. "No," she said, "I cannot send forget-me-nots after those who never were. I can send only pansies." Chapter 6, The Red-Haired Girl. A wife's story. In 1876 we took a house in one of the best streets and parts of B. I do not give the name of the street or the number of the house, because the circumstances that occurred in that place were such as to make people nervous, and shy, unreasonably so, of taking those lodgings, after reading our experiences therein. We were a small family, my husband, a grown-up daughter, and myself, and we had 2 maids a cook, and the other was house and parlour-maid in one. We had not been a fortnight in the house before my daughter said to me one morning, "Mamma, I do not like Jane." That was our house parlour-maid. "Why so?" I asked. "She seems respectable, and she does her work systematically. I have no fault to find with her, none whatever. She may do her work, said Bessie, my daughter, but I dislike inquisitiveness. Inquisitiveness, I exclaimed. What do you mean? Has she been looking into your drawers? No, Mamma, but she watches me. It is hot weather now, and when I am in my room occasionally I leave my door open whilst writing a letter, or doing any little bit of needlework, and then I am almost certain to hear her outside. If I turn sharply round, I see her slipping out of sight. It is most annoying. I really was unaware that I was such an interesting personage as to make it worth anyone's while to spy out my proceedings. Nonsense, my dear. You are sure it is Jane? Well, I suppose so. There was a slight hesitation in her voice. If not Jane, who can it be? Are you sure it is not Cook? Oh no, it is not Cook. She is busy in the kitchen. I have heard her there, when I have gone outside my room upon the landing, after having caught that girl watching me. If you have caught her, said I suppose you spoke to her about the impropriety of her conduct. Well, caught is the wrong word. I have not actually caught her at it. Only today I distinctly heard her at my door, and I saw her back as she turned to run away when I went towards her. But you followed her, of course. Yes, but I did not find her on the landing when I got outside. Where was she then? I don't know. But did you not go and see? She slipped away with astonishing celerity, said Bessie. I can take no steps in the matter. If she does it again, speak to her and remonstrate. But I never have a chance. She is gone in a moment. She cannot get away so quickly as all that. Somehow she does. And you are sure it is Jane? Again I asked, and again she replied, If not Jane, who else can it be? There is no one else in the house. So this unpleasant matter ended, for the time. The next intimation of something of the sort proceeded from another quarter, in fact, from Jane herself. She came to me some days later and said, with some embarrassment in her tone, If you please, ma'am, if I do not give satisfaction, I would rather leave the situation. Leave? I exclaimed. Why, I have not given you the slightest cause. I have not found fault with you for anything as yet, have I, Jane? On the contrary, I have been much pleased with the thoroughness of your work. And you are always tidy and obliging. It isn't that, Mum, but I don't like being watched whatever I do. Watched, I repeated. What do you mean? You surely do not suppose that I am running after you when you are engaged on your occupations. I assure you I have other and more important things to do. No, ma'am, I don't suppose you do. Then who watches you? I think it must be Miss Bessie. Miss Bessie. I could say no more, I was so astounded. Yes, ma'am. When I am sweeping out a room, and my back is turned, I hear her at the door, and when I turn myself about, I just catch a glimpse of her running away. I see her skirts. Miss Bessie is above doing anything of the sort. If it is not Miss Bessie, who is it, ma'am? There was a tone of indecision in her voice. My good Jane, said I, set your mind at rest. Miss Bessie could not act as you suppose. Have you seen her on these occasions and assured yourself that it is she? No, ma'am, I've not, so to speak, seen her face, but I know it ain't Cook, and I'm sure it ain't you, ma'am, so who else can it be? I considered for some moments, and the maid stood before me in dubious mood. You say you saw her skirts. Did you recognize the gown? What did she wear? It was a light cotton print, more like a maid's morning dress. Well, set your mind at ease, Miss Bessie has not got such a frock as you describe. I don't think she has, said Jane, but there was someone at the door watching me who ran away when I turned myself about. Did she run upstairs or down? I don't know. I did go out on the landing, but there was no one there. I'm sure it wasn't Cook, for I heard her clattering the dishes down in the kitchen at the time. Well, Jane, there is some mystery in this. I will not accept your notice. We will let matters stand over till we can look into this complaint of yours and discover the rights of it. Thank you, ma'am. I'm very comfortable here, but it is unpleasant to suppose that one is not trusted and is spied on wherever one goes and whatever one is about. A week later, after dinner one evening, when Bessie and I had quitted the table and left my husband to his smoke, Bessie said to me, when we were in the drawing-room together, Mamma, it is not Jane. What is not Jane? I asked. It is not Jane who watches me. Who can it be then? I don't know. And how is it that you are confident that you are not being observed by Jane? Because I have seen her, That is to say, her head. When? Where? While dressing for dinner, I was before the glass doing my hair, when I saw in the mirror someone behind me. I had only the 2 candles lighted on the table, and the room was otherwise dark. I thought I heard someone stirring, just the sort of stealthy step I have come to recognize as having troubled me so often. I did not turn, but looked steadily before me into the glass, and I could see reflected therein someone, a woman with red hair. Then I moved from my place quickly. I heard steps of some person hurrying away, but I saw no one then. The door was open. No, it was shut. But where did she go? I do not know, Mamma. I looked everywhere in the room and could find no one. I have been quite upset. I cannot tell what to think of this. I feel utterly unhinged. I noticed at table that you did not appear well, but I said nothing about it. Your father gets so alarmed and fidgets and fusses if he thinks that there is anything the matter with you. But this is a most extraordinary story. It is an extraordinary fact, said Bessie. You have searched your room thoroughly. I have looked into every corner, and there is no one there. No one. Would you mind Mamma sleeping with me tonight? I am so frightened. Do you think it can be a ghost? Ghost? Fiddlesticks. I made some excuse to my husband and spent the night in Bessie's room. There was no disturbance that night of any sort, and although my daughter was excited and unable to sleep till long after midnight, she did fall into refreshing slumber at last, and in the morning said to me, Mamma, I think I must have fancied that I saw something in the glass. I dare say my nerves were overwrought. I was greatly relieved to hear this, and I arrived at much the same conclusion as did Bessie, but was again bewildered, and my mind unsettled by Jane, who came to me just before lunch, when I was alone, and said, Please, ma'am, it's only fair to say, but it's not Miss Bessie. What is not Miss Bessie? I mean, who is not Miss Bessie? Her as is spying on me. I told you it could not be she. Who is it? Please, ma'am, I don't know. It's a red-haired girl. But Jane, be serious. There is no red-haired girl in the house. I know there ain't, ma'am. But for all that, she spies on me. Be reasonable, Jane, I said, disguising the shock her words produced on me. If there be no red-haired girl in the house, how can you have one watching you? I don't know, but one does. How do you know that she is red-haired? Because I have seen her. When? This morning, indeed. Yes, ma'am. I was going upstairs when I heard steps coming softly after me. The back stairs, ma'am. They're rather dark and steep, and there's no carpet on them, as on the front stairs. And I was sure I heard someone following me, so I twisted about, thinking it might be Cook. But it wasn't. I saw a young woman in a print dress, and the light as came from the window at the side fell on her head, and it was Carrots, reglar Carrots. Did you see her face? No, ma'am. She put her arm up and turned and ran downstairs, and I went after her, but I never found her. You followed her? How far? To the kitchen. Cook was there, and I said to Cook, says I, did you see a girl come this way? And she said short like, no. And Cook saw nothing at all, nothing. She didn't seem best pleased at my axing. I suppose I frightened her, as I'd been telling her about how I was followed and spied on. I mused a moment only, and then said solemnly, Jane, what you want is a pill. You are suffering from hallucinations. I know a case very much like yours, and take my word for it that, in your condition of liver or digestion, a pill is a sovereign remedy. Set your mind at rest. This is a mere delusion, caused by pressure on the optic nerve. I will give you a pill tonight when you go to bed, another tomorrow, a third on the day after, and that will settle the red-haired girl. You will see no more of her. You think so, ma'am? I am sure of it. On consideration, I thought it as well to mention the matter to the cook, a strange, reserved woman, not given to talking, who did her work admirably, but whom, for some inexplicable reason, I did not like. If I had considered a little further as to how to broach the subject, I should perhaps have proved more successful, but by not doing so, I rushed the question and obtained no satisfaction. I had gone down to the kitchen to order dinner, and the difficult question had arisen how to dispose of the scraps from yesterday's joint. Rissoles, ma'am? No, said I, not rissoles. Your master objects to them. Then perhaps croquettes? They are only rissoles in disguise. Perhaps cottage pie? No, that is inorganic rissole, a sort of protoplasm out of which rissoles are developed. Then, ma'am, I might make a hash. Not an ordinary barefaced rudimentary hash. No, ma'am, with French mushrooms or truffles or tomatoes. Well, yes, perhaps. By the way, talking of tomatoes, who is that red-haired girl who has been about the house? Can't say, ma'am. I noticed at once that the eyes of the cook contracted, her lips tightened, and her face assumed a half-defiant, half-terrified look. You have not many friends in this place, have you, cook? No, ma'am, none. Then who can she be? Can't say, ma'am. You can throw no light on the matter. It is very unsatisfactory having a person about the house, and she has been seen upstairs of whom one knows nothing. No doubt, ma'am. And you cannot enlighten me? She is no friend of mine, nor is she of Jane's. Jane spoke to me about her. Has she remarked concerning this girl to you? Can't say, ma'am, as I notice all Jane says. She talks a good deal. You see, there must be someone who is a stranger, and who has access to this house. It is most awkward. Very so, ma'am. I could get nothing more from the cook. I might as well have talked to a log, and indeed her face assumed a wooden look as I continued to speak to her on the matter. So I sighed and said, "Very well, hash with tomato," and went upstairs. A few days later the house parlour-maid said to me, "Please, ma'am, may I have another pill?" "Pill?" I exclaimed. "Why?" "Because I have seen her again." She was behind the curtains, and I caught her putting out her red head to look at me. Did you see her face? No, she up with her arm over it and scuttled away. This is strange. I do not think I have more than 2 podophyllin pills left in the box, but to those you are welcome. Only I should recommend a different treatment. Instead of taking them yourself, the moment you see, or fancy that you see, the red-haired girl, go at her with the box and threaten to administer the pills to her. That will rout her, if anything will. But she will not stop for the pills. The threat of having them forced on her every time she shows herself will disconcert her. Conceive, I am supposing, that on each occasion Miss Bessie or I were to meet you on the stairs, in a room, on the landing, in the hall. We were to rush on you and force, let us say, castor oil globules between your lips. You would give notice at once. Yes, so I should, ma'am. Well, try this upon the red-haired girl. It will prove infallible. Thank you, ma'am. What you say seems reasonable. Whether Bessie saw more of the puzzling apparition I cannot say. She spoke no further on the matter to me, but that may have been so as to cause me no further uneasiness. I was unable to resolve the question to my own satisfaction, whether what had been seen was a real person who obtained access to the house in some unaccountable manner, or whether it was what I have called it, an apparition. As far as I could ascertain, nothing had been taken away. The movements of the red-haired girl were not those of one who sought to pilfer. They seemed to me rather those of one not in her right mind, and on this supposition I made inquiries in the neighbourhood as to the existence in our street, in any of the adjoining houses, of a person wanting in her wits, who was suffered to run about at will. But I could obtain no information that at all threw light on a point to me so perplexing. Hitherto I had not mentioned the topic to my husband. I knew so well that I should obtain no help from him, that I made no effort to seek it. He would pish and pshaw, and make some slighting reference to women's intellects, and not further trouble himself about the matter. But one day, to my great astonishment,